From the banks of the Nile, a life begins in secret. A prince raised in gold, yet burdened by truth. One act of defiance, and a kingdom becomes his enemy. Through deserts of exile, a voice calls from fire, plagues shatter gods, and chains break in the night. The sea parts, and a nation walks to freedom. On a mountain of fire, law is carved into stone. But even leaders stumble, and promises remain just beyond reach. This is the story of a man chosen to lead, yet humbled to serve. The story of Moses.
What if I told you Moses wasn't just a prophet, but a prince who turned his back on power to answer a divine call? His journey from Egypt's golden halls to the wilderness's burning bush is one of history's most dramatic changes. Stay with me as we uncover how a man once groomed to rule an empire became the humble servant of God, leading his people out of slavery and into destiny. The Nile's currents carried more than water the day Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe. They took a fragile basket holding a 3-month-old Hebrew boy, his fate hanging between royal mercy and royal decree. His mother had hidden him since birth, defying Pharaoh's order to drown all Hebrew male infants. When concealment became impossible, she waterproofed a papyrus basket with tar and set it among the reeds, a desperate gamble that her son might live as a slave rather than die as a statistic. Egyptian adoption customs favored the elite. Royal women often took in children to secure political alliances or display benevolence. But when Pharaoh's daughter opened that basket and heard the baby cry, something unexpected happened. She recognized him as Hebrew, yet chose to raise him as her own, naming him Moses, drawn from water, a constant reminder of his origins. His biological mother became his wet nurse, paid by the palace to feed her child, teaching him Hebrew prayers even as he learned Egyptian hieroglyphs. The boy grew up in gold-lined corridors where servants catered to his every whim. He wore linen finer than any Hebrew ever touched and studied warfare, mathematics, and astronomy with royal tutors. Yet whispers followed him. Slave quarters gossip about his true heritage, the way his olive skin darkened differently than his adoptive cousins. He mastered chariot riding and courtly manners, while his people hauled bricks under whips. Every birthday celebration contrasted with the groans of laborers outside palace walls. Historical records show how Egyptian princes trained for leadership through military campaigns and temple rituals. Moses would have participated in ceremonies honoring Ra and Osiris, gods his Hebrew relatives rejected. The tension simmered beneath his polished exterior, a prince who knew the taste of his mother's slave-ration bread, a warrior taught to despise the people whose blood ran in his veins. At night, when torches flickered across muraled walls depicting Pharaoh's victories, Moses likely wondered about the unrecorded stories, those of the slaves building monuments to their oppression. His conflicting identities created an increasing divide. The pampered prince slept on goose-down pillows, while his biological father broke his back on construction sites. This collision of worlds couldn't last. The moment would come when Moses had to choose between the palace that raised him and the people he couldn't forget. His royal status was both a shield and a lie, a gilded cage hiding the truth written in the calluses of Hebrew hands. The Nile's waters had spared him for a purpose far beyond court intrigues. Little did Pharaoh's daughter know, the child she rescued would become the man who shattered her father's empire. The river that delivered Moses to privilege would one day divide under his outstretched hand, heralding the doom of the very dynasty that cradled him. Moses left the palace walls more frequently as he grew older. He walked the work sites where Hebrew slaves mixed mortar and hauled stone, their backs striped with lash marks. Royal guards nodded as he passed. The prince had eccentric habits. Every glance at these laborers carried an unspoken recognition. These were his people, though none knew it yet. Then came the day he witnessed an overseer beating a Hebrew slave near death. The crack of the rod against flesh etched Oad across the worksite. Some scholars suggest Moses had seen violence before, but never directed at someone who common among adoptees surfaced violently in that moment, the conflict between upbringing and bloodline, between loyalty and rage. Without planning, Moses struck. Ancient texts describe his fatal blow to the Egyptian as a sudden, irreversible act. He buried the body in sand, but secrets don't stay buried in empires where informants lurk everywhere. By sundown, witnesses had talked. Pharaoh's court couldn't ignore a prince murdering an official, regardless of motive. Royal scrolls from the period reference executions for lesser crimes against the state. Modern psychologists note how adopted children often experience genealogical bewilderment when biological and adoptive identities clash. Moses embodied this perfectly. His Egyptian education told him slaves deserved punishment, while his Hebrew blood recognized injustice. The murder wasn't just about saving one man, it was decades of suppressed duality exploding outward. Word reached Pharaoh within hours. A death sentence was issued immediately. Egyptian law treated rebellion among royals with particular severity, especially when it threatened the slave system that built their monuments. Messengers spread through the night with orders to bring Moses' head to the palace steps. He fled east toward the desert with only what he could carry. No chariots, no attendants. Behind him, the Nile's waters reflected the torches of pursuers. Ahead lay the brutal expanse of the Sinai wilderness, where survival rates for unprepared travelers hovered near zero. Egyptian border patrols hunted him, while nomadic clans viewed strangers as threats or prey. The event marked the abrupt end of 40 years as royalty. Gone were the feasts, the silk robes, and the deference. Now he was a fugitive with a price on his head, breathing dust instead of perfume. The man who once commanded armies would soon sleep beside goats in a foreign land. Yet this desperate flight became the turning point history needed. The pampered prince had to die for the true leader to emerge. Moses didn't know it yet, but the desert ahead would forge him into someone unrecognizable to Pharaoh's court, a man stripped of privilege, ready for a greater purpose. The same hands that swung a sword in rage would one day hold a staff that split the sea. The Sinai wilderness offered no royal welcome for the fugitive prince. Moses stumbled into the territory of the Midianites, a nomadic tribe descended from Abraham. Their flocks were their wealth, and their tents offered no columns or mosaics, just goat hair fabric stretched over wooden poles. Here, the man who once wore jeweled collars now wrapped his head in rough wool against the desert sun. Shepherding was relentless work. Ancient pastoralists moved constantly, tracking sparse vegetation across hundreds of miles. Each day demanded identifying edible plants, locating hidden water sources, and defending flocks from jackals. Egyptian texts describe nomadic life as the existence of flies, constant motion, perpetual hardship. For Moses, this was survival stripped to its essence. No scribes recorded his deeds here. Only sheep witnessed his struggles. Archaeological finds reveal how shepherds developed extraordinary navigation skills. They memorized star patterns, read rock formations, and detected distant rainfall by scent. Moses learned to lead animals through trackless wastes, a skill that would later prove vital. Nights brought biting cold, days brought scorching heat. The desert neither knew nor cared about his royal past. At a well near Midian's camp, Moses intervened when local shepherds harassed 7 sisters drawing water. The act earned him lodging with their father, Jethro, a priest. Here, the former prince exchanged military training for sheep reading, studying lunar cycles for seasonal migrations. He married Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, whose sharp eyes could spot predators before the flock stirred. Meaning foreigner, etched Moses' displacement into family memory. Domestic life contrasted starkly with palace expectations. Where Egyptian wives had servants, Zipporah worked alongside him, repairing tents and milling grain. Children played near open fires, not gilded courtyards. This was existence pared down to bread, wool, and walking. Historians note that Midianite women held significant authority. Zipporah's quick thinking later saved Moses' life during a divine encounter. The decades sanded away his Egyptian reflexes. His hands, once soft from oils, toughened into leather from gripping staffs. The commander's stride became the shepherd's plodding gait. He learned patience watching ewes give birth to lambs and persistence when searching for strays. These weren't wasted years, they were preparation. Wilderness survival required reading landscapes, just as palace life demanded reading men. Both skills would converge when his moment arrived. Moses didn't know his exile had an expiration date. 40 years erased entitlement, replacing it with something far more valuable: humility forged through blistered feet and empty stomachs. The desert was his refiner's fire, burning away arrogance until only raw conviction remained. When God finally spoke from flames, Moses wouldn't respond as a prince, but as a shepherd, accustomed to following unseen paths, trained to lead stubborn flocks through impossible terrain. The man who fled Egypt's wrath was no longer the man Egypt would face. Fear had been replaced by faith, not in himself, but in the ground beneath his sandals and the staff in his hand. Every rock he slept beside, every storm he weathered, was preparing him to stand before Pharaoh not as a royal heir, but as an unshakable instrument of divine will. The sheep grazed on sparse mountain grass when Moses first noticed the bush. Flames licked its branches, yet the leaves remained unnaturally green. Fire without consumption defied the desert's rules. Thorn bushes here burned black in minutes. He edged closer, sandals scraping against flint-strewn ground. Then the voice came, not from the mountain winds, but from the fire itself. Moses, Moses. Ancient Hebrew traditions held that God spoke through ordinary things: whirlwinds, donkeys, and now a scrub brush alive with holy fire. This wasn't Babylon's fiery furnace or Egypt's sacred braziers. The bush blazed unconsumed, asserting divine presence without destruction. Scholars note how biblical theophanies often use paradoxical elements: fire that doesn't burn, light that blinds, and voices from emptiness. Moses hid his face, afraid to see what made the ground holy. The voice identified itself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a deliberate callback to his buried heritage. After 40 years tending another man's flock, he was being summoned to lead his people. 5 times Moses resisted. First came the fundamental doubt: who am I to face Pharaoh? The shepherd who once commanded armies now questioned his worth. God's response shifted focus: I will be with you, making presence more important than pedigree. Moses then asked for God's name, receiving the enigmatic I am, a verb declaring eternal existence beyond Egyptian pantheons of dying and rising gods. His third objection revealed lingering trauma: they won't believe me. The murderous fugitive feared his people's rejection. God responded with 3 signs: the staff turning into a serpent, his hand becoming leprous and then healing, and water changing into blood. These were physical proofs meant to silence skeptics. Fourth came the speech impediment, perhaps acquired during decades without Hebrew conversation: I'm slow of tongue. God countered by appointing his brother Aaron as spokesperson, a solution that later complicated their leadership. The final protest was the simplest:
Underlay the refusal.
send someone 80-year-old bones preferred desert obscurity to confronting empires. Yet every objection met a divine adjustment, not dismissal. The dialogue reveals a God who accommodates human weakness without lowering standards. Archaeologists note that acacia bushes still dot Mount Horeb's slopes. The encounter's legacy ignited history, despite the absence of any supernatural fire today. That fire didn't just transform a bush, it reignited Moses' purpose. The reluctant shepherd left with 3 gifts: a staff of authority, a promise of partnership, and a name that reduced deities to dust. Egyptian texts boast of pharaohs claiming divinity, yet here stood the eternal I Am, commissioning a stammering octogenarian to dismantle slavery's machinery. When the flames faded, Moses carried the fire within him. Every step toward Egypt would test whether he truly believed burning bushes could topple pyramids. The voice that interrupted his shepherding didn't just call him out of Midian, it called forward the leader forged through palace halls and desert sands. Sinai's holy ground wasn't a place to visit, but a moment to depart from, carrying unquenchable purpose toward the waiting showdown with Pharaoh. That solitary bush's fire would soon spread across an entire nation, lighting the path from chains to destiny. Moses stood barefoot on holy ground, the burning bush's light fading from his eyes, but its weight settling on his shoulders. The command was clear: confront Pharaoh, demand freedom for the Hebrews. Yet instead of action, objections poured forth. His resistance wasn't defiance, but the tremor of buried insecurities. 40 years as a fugitive had reshaped the once confident prince into a man who measured words carefully around his stutter, who preferred tending silent sheep to commanding crowds. Leadership studies show this pattern. The most transformational figures often resist their calling the hardest. The speech impediment troubled Moses most. Ancient texts describe his tongue as heavy, possibly from decades without speaking Hebrew fluently or a childhood injury never mentioned in palace records. Whatever the cause, it symbolized his deeper fear: inadequacy. How could a man who struggled with basic sentences challenge Egypt's golden-tongued orators? God's solution created new complications. Aaron would speak for him, but siblings remember old wounds. Aaron, who grew up free among Hebrews while Moses lived in privilege, now had to voice another's convictions. Their partnership would later fracture under this imbalance. At the staff's transformation, Moses recoiled. The wooden rod, his shepherd's tool, became a serpent, then solidified back into wood at his grasp. Modern miracle skeptics suggest mass hypnosis or desert hallucination, but Moses felt the scaled flesh under his fingers. The sign meant more than divine power. It confirmed his ordinary tools could channel the extraordinary. Yet even after this, Moses pleaded, "Send someone else." Trauma lingered beneath his resistance: the burned bridges of his Egyptian past, the blood-stained sand of his botched vigilante justice. Reluctant leaders throughout history share this hesitation. Studies of revolutionary figures reveal how often they initially refuse their roles, from revolutionary leaders to spiritual reformers. The weight of change crushes before it elevates. Moses embodied this tension. The shepherd who'd failed as a savior before was now asked to try again with only a staff and a stammer. The burning bush dialogue spans fewer than 40 verses, but reveals lifetimes of conflict. Moses raises 5 objections. God answers each without dismissal. Their exchange models a paradox. The creator of stars negotiating with a runaway shepherd, the final refusal, "Send someone else," meets no rebuttal, just silent expectation. Sometimes destiny isn't about willingness, Egypt, but staff in hand, every step carried doubts. Would Pharaoh even remember the disgraced prince? Would the Hebrews trust a stranger who fled decades earlier? Leadership often begins not with confidence, but with trembling obedience. The reluctant prophet walked forward not because his fears vanished, but because the fire's voice overpowered them. His journey back to Egypt would test whether divine assurances could sustain human fragility when pyramids and armies stood in the way. That stutter would soon speak words to shake empires, proving that broken vessels carry water just as well, if they stop resisting the hand that pours. The confrontation began with a mocking laugh. Pharaoh lounged on his throne when Moses and Aaron demanded Hebrew freedom, his jeweled fingers tapping the armrest. "Who is this Yahweh that I am expected to obey?" The question dripped with contempt for a god absent from Egypt's pantheon. Royal advisors smirked until the Nile turned to blood the next morning. Such an event wasn't just misfortune. It was targeted warfare. The life-giving river, the embodiment of the god Hapi, now reeked of death. Fish floated belly up as Egyptians dug desperate wells, their sacred waters made poison. 7 days later, frogs overran homes. The goddess Heket, depicted with a frog's head, oversaw fertility, yet her creatures now died in stinking piles. Then came lice from the dust, humiliating priests who prided ritual purity. Swarms of flies followed, bypassing Hebrew districts entirely. Each plague struck another pillar of Egyptian theology. The sun god Ra's power dimmed when darkness fell. The cattle goddess Hathor watched powerless as livestock dropped dead. Pharaoh's heart hardened like Nile clay in drought. Ancient texts describe this as both his choice and divine strengthening, a judicial hardening that cemented rebellion's consequences. Court magicians replicated early plagues, but by the boils they stood scratching their blistered skin, unable to mimic disaster. The hailstorm ruined flax and barley crops, stripping Egypt's economy layer by layer. Locusts finished what remained, darkening skies until green vanished from the land. Ordinary Egyptians suffered most. Workers who built tombs now buried livestock. Mothers wailed as boils covered children. The wealthy paid Hebrews for remedies, reversing the master-slave dynamic. Yet Pharaoh still refused, his obstinacy fueled by advisors whispering of lost productivity and imperial shame. Economic records from neighboring kingdoms note Egypt's sudden grain shortages during this period. The final plague loomed as Moses warned of firstborn deaths. Egyptian theology centered on the pharaoh as the people's divine protector. Now, he would fail catastrophically. Homes lacking lamb's blood on doorposts would lose their heirs, from dungeon prisoners to the palace itself. The stage was set for a midnight reckoning that would crack Egypt's spiritual foundation. This was no random disaster sequence. Each plague dismantled the mythology propping up Pharaoh's divinity. The Nile's lifeblood soured. The sun, which Ra ruled, went dark. Even Pharaoh's supposed control over death would shatter when his son perished. Hebrew slaves watched their masters' gods fall one by one, revealing powerless idols behind the empire's glittering facade. Egypt's pantheon crumbled not through philosophical debate, but through tangible defeat. The plagues exposed a simple truth. The gods who supposedly blessed oppression couldn't save their worshippers. As the death toll mounted, a more profound casualty emerged: the myth of Egyptian invincibility. By the 9th plague, commoners begged Pharaoh to relent while advisors plotted coups. The empire stood on the brink, its spirituality, ill armor peeled away layer by providential layer. What began with scoffing disbelief ended with a broken nation pleading for slaves to leave. They were revelations, exposing hollow deities before the one God who needed no idols or incantations to act. The final warning came at dusk. Moses delivered God's ultimatum to Pharaoh. At midnight, death would visit every Egyptian firstborn. There would be no further negotiations. There would be no more warnings. The Hebrews received strange, precise instructions: select an unblemished lamb, slaughter it at twilight, brush its blood on doorposts, then roast the meat with bitter herbs. They were to eat standing up, belts fastened, sandals on. Archaeologists note that spring lamb sacrifices existed in neighboring cultures, but none combined ritual slaughter with such urgent preparation for departure. Families gathered nervously as fathers wielded knives against docile yearlings. The blood applied to lintels wasn't decorative. It served as a covenant marker distinguishing Hebrew homes from Egyptian. Texts from Ugarit describe similar protective rites where blood warded off divine wrath. The bitter herbs recalled slavery's taste. The unleavened bread marked the haste of coming deliverance. Children asked why this night differed.
a question still echoed in Jewish seders today. Midnight struck like a hammer. Across Egypt, wails pierced the dark as mortality struck palace and hovel alike. Pharaoh's son died in silk sheets, while Hebrew toddlers slept untouched behind blood-marked doors. Scholars debate whether natural disease or supernatural intervention caused the deaths, but ancient accounts agree on one point: the targeting was precise. Egyptian medical papyri contain no records of selective plagues, making this event unique in their history. Before sunrise, a shaken pharaoh summoned Moses. "Go!" he roared, his voice cracking. Court officials who had sneered just days earlier now pressed jewelry into the hands of the Hebrews, sang victory songs, now screamed at Moses, "Were there no graves in Egypt? You brought us out to die in the wilderness." The abrupt shift from triumph to terror revealed their lingering slave mentality. Better known bondage than uncertain freedom. Oceanographers have studied potential crossing sites for centuries. The Hebrew term Yam Suf likely referred to the marshy Lake Timsah or the Gulf of Suez's northern tip, both locations where seasonal winds could expose land bridges. Satellite imaging shows underwater ridges that match ancient trade routes between Egypt and Sinai. But no natural phenomenon explains what happened next. Moses stood knee-deep in reeds, staff raised, as chariots closed the distance. The people expected a battle formation, not prayer. His command, "Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord," clashed with every survival instinct. Then the east wind came, not a breeze but a roar that peeled back the waters like a scroll of parchment. The seabed emerged, muddy but solid, flanked by towering liquid walls that defied gravity. Marine biologists note how wind-set-down events can expose small areas temporarily, but nothing compares to the biblical account's scale or duration. Families stumbled forward into the damp corridor. Children clutched parents as crustaceans skittered across their path. The water walls shimmered oddly, catching dawn light in ways salt water shouldn't. Some scholars suggest the miracle wasn't just the parting, but the timing, a precise window between Pharaoh's arrival and the sea reforming. Egypt's army charged into the path without hesitation. Their chariot wheels, designed for desert sand, sank into seabed mud. Then Moses stretched his staff again. The collapsing waters didn't just drown, they crushed. Bronze helmets and horse bones were later found washed ashore, according to first-century historian Josephus. The same sea that baptized Hebrew freedom became Egypt's liquid grave. This moment tested faith more profoundly than any plague. At the Nile, they'd been passive recipients of protection. Here, they had to walk between tsunami walls on nothing but a promise. The crossing became Judaism's defining metaphor. Liberation isn't given but claimed through terrifying steps of trust. Marine archaeologists still debate locations while missing the point. Whether it occurred at Suez or Aqaba matters less than what it revealed about the human capacity to walk forward while death looms on both sides. The survivors on the far shore sang a song never forgotten. Slave voices that once pleaded to return to Egypt now roared choruses of deliverance. Miriam beat her drum, leading women in dances that shook desert sand from their sandals. They weren't just celebrating escape. They bore witness that faith could part seas when human logic saw only certain drowning. The Red Sea didn't just mark a border crossing. It drew a line through history where the physics of oppression shattered before the deeper law of liberation. Any later complaining about wilderness hardships would overlook this truth. The same God who held back oceans could provide water from rocks. The miracle established a pattern. When people stepped forward despite fear, paths appeared where none existed before. Pharaoh's army lay submerged, yet their greatest defeat wasn't losing slaves, but failing to understand that no system built on chains can withstand the tide of divine justice. The sea that closed over Egyptian arrogance opened for Hebrew faith, proving that freedom's road often runs through impossible crossings. The wilderness stretched endlessly beneath Mount Sinai's jagged silhouette. 3 months had passed since the Red Sea crossing, but the Israelites had already forgotten the miracle. They quarreled over water, complained about manna, and whispered that Egypt's meat pots were better than starvation. Former slaves struggling to trust freedom's uncertainty. Their journey stalled at Sinai's base, where God would rewrite their identity, not through provision, but with law. Smoke enveloped the mountain on the third morning. It was not wildfire haze, but rather a churning, thunder-lit darkness that caused the people to tremble. Trumpet blasts sounded from nowhere, growing louder until families covered their ears. Exodus describes the peak as all in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Geologists note Sinai's volcanic stability, suggesting supernatural origins for the quaking mountain. Moses alone climbed toward the voice in the fire, disappearing into the gloom while the camp waited below. Ancient Near Eastern law codes provide a stark contrast to Sinai's revelation. Hammurabi's laws promoted societal order through retribution, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But the Ten Commandments framed morality as a sacred covenant, beginning with, "You shall have no other gods before me." Archaeologists compare Sinai's theophany to Hittite vassal treaties, where overlords dictated terms to subjects. Yet here, the terms weren't imposed, they were offered, with blessing conditional on obedience. Moses fasted 40 days on that mountain, while God inscribed commandments on stone with divine fingers. Desert asceticism traditions likely stem from this episode, the idea that revelation comes through hunger and isolation. The Israelite leader received more than just rules. He witnessed the blueprint of the heavenly temple, acquired knowledge of sacrificial systems, and experienced mercy while seated above the cherubim of the ark. These weren't arbitrary decrees, but the architecture for a holy nation. Meanwhile, the congregation grew restless. Days passed without their leader returning. The fire on Sinai continued burning, yet doubt spread like whispered heresy. People who witnessed the sea part now demanded tangible proof of God's presence. Their gold earrings, likely plundered from Egyptians, became raw material for compromise. The tension builds toward an unthinkable act. Liberated slaves reverting to visible idols barely 3 months after deliverance. When Moses descended, his face glowed with unnatural light, terrifying those who saw him. The radiance wasn't just visual, it testified to time spent in transcendent presence. Paul would later reference this in Corinthians when contrasting Old and New covenants. But Moses didn't yet know what awaited in camp. The stones in his hands bore foundational ethics that would shape civilizations, prohibitions against murder and theft, and calls to honor parents and keep oaths, not just civil codes, but divine expectations carved by heavenly fire. This moment marked the transformation from runaway slaves to covenanted people. The commandments weren't restrictive fences, but identity markers separating them from Egyptian pantheism and Canaanite brutality. Sinai's fire burned away spiritual ambiguity, offering either holy alignment with God's nature or the consequences of defiance. The trembling mountain wasn't the climax. That would come when Moses saw the golden calf at camp's center and shattered the stones in righteous fury. Even divine law written in fire couldn't compete with human impatience for something tangible to worship. The people counted 40 days, then 41. By the 5th week without Moses, whispers spread through the Israelite camp. Their leader had vanished into Sinai's perpetual smoke cloud. The mountain still rumbled occasionally, but faith eroded faster than canyon walls in flash floods. Humans crave visible certainty, especially those freshly liberated from slavery. Psychological studies show how quickly traumatized groups revert to familiar patterns when stressed. For people raised amid Egypt's idol-lined streets, an invisible God proved difficult to trust. As acting leader, he heard the demands, "Make us gods who will go before us." Archaeological digs throughout Canaan reveal how prevalent bull idol worship was. Golden calves symbolized strength and fertility. Aaron's request for gold earrings played on multiple fears. Without Moses, without visible divine presence, they believed themselves abandoned in the wilderness. The molten calf wasn't just rebellion, it was a security blanket fashioned from trauma. The shaping of the idol reveals the people's spiritual confusion. They proclaimed, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt," while dancing before a single calf. Some scholars suggest syncretism, attempting to merge Yahweh worship with familiar iconography. Others see raw panic. Either way, the celebration turned debauched. Exodus uses the same Hebrew word for revelry that describes pagan orgies in other texts. Moses descended from Sinai with stone tablets bearing divine script when shouts reached his ears. The glow still radiated from his face, making his horrified expression all the more jarring. Below, his brother presided over sacrifices to a gold statue. The tablets slipped from his hands before he consciously decided to drop them. The shattered fragments at the mountain's base symbolized the broken covenant before Moses even reached camp. Historical accounts agree on Aaron's weak excuse. "They gave me the gold, I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." The excuse collapses under scrutiny. Detailed calf idols don't emerge spontaneously from melting pots. Archaeology confirms that deliberate craftsmanship was required for such statues. Aaron's compliance, whether from fear or faulty leadership, nearly doomed the nation. Moses burned the idol, ground it to powder, and made the people drink the bitter water, an ancient method for administering cure, says mentioned in Numbers. The Levites rallied to his side, executing 3,000 rebels in a purge that stained the sand. Yet even in judgment, Moses interceded, offering to blot himself from God's book to save the people. The confrontation reveals the tension between justice and mercy that would dominate Israel's story. Judaism used the golden calf incident as a warning against impatient idol-making. Later prophets would reference it when condemning northern Israel's calf shrines. But the deeper lesson concerns spiritual memory, how quickly humans substitute tangible imitations when the real God seems delayed. The people who crossed the Red Sea now worshipped a craftsman's project. The tablets lay broken, but Moses would return to the mountain. Forgiveness was possible, though the consequences would echo through generations wandering the wilderness. Sinai's revelation wasn't revoked, just postponed until hearts proved ready to bear its weight. The golden calf didn't just represent other gods, it exposed how swiftly divine liberation could be traded for golden counterfeits when faith wavers. The scouts returned from Canaan with a cluster of grapes so large it took 2 men to carry it. Their report split the camp. The land flowed with milk and honey, but its cities had walls to the sky and men like giants. 10 spies spread terror through the tribes, describing themselves as grasshoppers in their own eyes. Only Joshua and Caleb were adamant about taking the land. The people wept all night, then rebelled at dawn, demanding new leadership to return to Egypt. Moses stood before them with his staff digging into the sand. 40 years earlier, he'd killed an Egyptian for abusing a Hebrew. Now his people threatened to stone him for leading them to freedom. His plea, "Do not rebel against the Lord," drowned in shouts. God's response was swift. This generation would die in the wilderness. Their children would inherit what they feared to claim. The Israelites turned south into the harshest part of the desert. The arid region shows how these routes lack reliable water sources. For 38 years, they wandered in widening circles, burying the faithless in unmarked graves. Each death raised the same unanswered question. How near had they come to streams they'd never drink from? At Kadesh, decades later, the people again cried for water. Moses took his staff to a rock, as he had years earlier when God instructed him to strike it. This time, fury gripped him. "Listen, you rebels," he shouted, hitting the stone twice. Water gushed, but the damage was done. God declared that Moses and Aaron would not lead Israel into Canaan. The reason was precise. They failed to uphold him as holy before the people. 6th-century Jewish commentators noted the subtle failure. Moses took credit for the miracle rather than directing attention to God alone. Others suggest his anger itself violated the leader's role. Either way, the punishment seemed severe for one outburst after decades of faithful service. Yet the lesson was clear. Leadership requires patience even with persistent complainers. Moses lived to see the next generation grown. He watched them defeat kingdoms east of the Jordan, proving Canaan's giants could fall. When his time came, he climbed Mount Nebo alone. Deuteronomy describes the view: the Dead Sea's metallic shimmer, Jericho's palm groves, and the distant Mediterranean. The land stretched before him, every valley he would never walk. His death came with no fanfare. God buried him in an unmarked Moabite grave. But the disappointment carried purpose. The lawgiver who delivered Israel couldn't be their conqueror. That task required Joshua, whose name meant Yahweh saves. Moses' barred entry wasn't just punishment, it was a passing of the torch. The man who led them off chains wasn't meant to lead them to rest. Centuries later, another prophet would stand, on a different mountain, surveying kingdoms he wouldn't enter. Like Moses, his greatest work was bringing people to the threshold of promises only others would fully inherit. Some callings are fulfilled not in attainment, but in making attainment possible for those who follow. The promised land was never Moses to possess, only to behold, then release. Moses' life traces the arc we all walk, from chains to calling, through deserts of doubt toward promised purpose. The prince who became a prophet shows how divine plans often start with shattered comforts. His story strips away illusions. Faith isn't about perfection, but persistence through failure. That staff in his weathered hand changed history not through might, but through obedience learned in obscurity. Your wilderness may not involve pyramids or parted seas, but the principle remains. What feels like wandering is forging. Those who stand on Nebo's heights always pass through Sinai's fires first. The question isn't if you'll face your Red Sea, but whether you'll lift your staff when it comes.